Last week, the question that we presented was, are the members of the Church of Christ the only ones going to heaven? Which is basically a pretty controversial question out in the world, because they think we have this attitude that we are the only ones. In reality, what is it?
Those who are faithful go to heaven.
Those who are faithful.
And a member of the Church of Christ.
The body.
The body.
The one body. I think that's the important part to remember anytime that we are talking to someone that brings that up. Well, you think you're the only ones going to heaven. We need to explain to them who we are. Because a lot of times we have the label Church of Christers, but they don't understand what that is. We use that label because it best describes who we are a part of. And I think too many times in the past it has been portrayed to them that we are the only ones. Just because we have that name. And it's not because we just have that name, it's because we are, as Cole said, we are faithful to the end. Mary Lou.
Well, a lot of people don't realize that Church of Christ is, Christians are followers of Christ.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. I mean, Church of Christ, Church of God, Disciples of Christ, we could have numerous names, couldn't we? But what do they mean? That we are part of the church that Christ purchased, that He established, that He told Peter, I'm going to establish my church. He died for it. Paul.
Roger mentioned that they're members of the Church of Christ. But a great many people don't understand membership.
Right.
It's not filling out a card.
Right.
It's those who the Lord has added
Right.
to His church.
It's not something that we vote on, is it? I mean, that's pretty common in some denominations. To become a member of the church, the elders or the congregation, whatever, they have to vote on you. Well, is he good enough to be a part of us? Where does it say anything like that in here? Nothing. Gary.
Being a follower of Christ does not mean that we were authorized to say who is going to make it to heaven.
Right.
That's only left up to one.
Mm-hmm.
We haven't been authorized to do it.
Right. And as Paul said, who adds them to the church? Christ. We don't.
Christ's blood does that.
And that's what it needs to be, I guess, explained thoroughly to those outside. Because there are a lot of people out in the world that claim to be Christians. Okay, and who are Christians? According to the Bible, who are Christians? Baptized believers, followers of Christ, those that remain faithful. That's the definition of Christian. What does the world say a Christian is? In general. A believer.
Yeah.
Cut and dry, a believer. We are believers, aren't we? We are believers.
Even Satan is.
Satan's a believer.
James chapter 2.
But there's more to it than just believing, isn't there? I mean, we know what believing is and what the process of believing is. But out there, they take believing as just saying, I believe in God. Or some say, I believe in God and don't believe in Christ. Some don't take it further as far as believing as being an action.
Well, at that point, it's just acknowledgement that they may or may not exist.
Exactly.
Not really putting it into action. That's just acknowledgement it might be the case.
Right. I mean, I could say, you know what? Bertram's, I believe they have really good food. Is that going to fill me? Just believing they have good food? I mean, in all honesty, is it going to fill me? Am I not going to be hungry? I believe they have good food. It takes action, doesn't it? And yet so many people, Jill and I talked about this before, there's so many people that believe that's all that's required, is believing. You could go into the saying the Lord's Prayer or asking for forgiveness and all of this stuff that goes along with that. But why is it so difficult to understand when there's numerous places in the Bible that tells us to be baptized? Why is that so hard to understand? I mean, they'll read other passages and believe it wholeheartedly.
A lot of it's based off their family traditions, which is not scriptural. But
Exactly. I think that is a lot of what people, they put their belief in the tradition of the family. Or in whatever pleases them. I think whatever connects them emotionally with something spiritual, or I think that's how they basically put themselves in a position to say, yes, I'm a Christian.
I think most people are like the Pharisees and Sadducees. They want to believe what they want to believe and then add to it what they think is good.
Right.
And then try to make that binding to everybody.
And the Pharisees and the Sadducees, they had something, a base, didn't they?
Yes,
They had a base to go on.
most people do.
And they do. Most people in the world, they have a base to go on. Well, there is a God. There are a few out there, yes, that they don't believe in God. But there is a base for most people that there is a God. And that He miraculously made things. And that maybe He sent a man that was perfect and He died for him. A lot of people believe that. But that's as far as they go. They don't go any further, Paul.
We can talk about all kinds of religious people, both outside the church and some inside
Inside.
the church.
Mhm.
People want a religion that is not costly.
Right.
Why would they not go against their family tradition? There's a big cost in that. Why would they not go against a lot of other things? There's a
Exactly.
cost in that.
And we have a tendency to always weigh the cost, which the Bible tells us to, doesn't it? The Bible tells us to weigh the cost of the decisions that we make. Do we truly measure the cost? When we became a Christian, when we were baptized into Christ, did we at that point, did we measure the cost that it would take from us? Think about that. Think about the day that you were converted and added to the church. Did you measure the cost? Because it did cost each one of us, didn't it? It could have cost our relationship in family. More than likely it cost a relationship in friends in the world. There's a lot of things that should have changed in our life by doing so. And if we look and find that it didn't really cost us that much, then we need to look again at what our relationship is with Christ. Because
Die to self.
die to self.
Live as Christ.
Exactly.
That's the big sacrifice that most people's not willing to do.
Exactly. I mean, we have the perfect examples of the disciples. They're out fishing. They know fishing like the back of their hand. They know it inside and out, what bait to use, where to put the nets, everything. And Jesus said, "Come follow me." And they left. They left that. Now, maybe a word of encouragement was, I'm going to make you fishers of men. Well, maybe they thought, hey, we're going to learn something more about fishing. But do you think in their mind at that moment when he said, follow me, that they thought, now what's this going to cost me? I wonder what this is going to cost me. Because they're leaving their job, but what about the other things? Friends, family, all of those other things. Did they truly count that cost? Or did they, by faith, step out and say, I'm going to follow you? Mary Lou.
I asked a minister one time, how come some of these denominations are not necessarily, some of them pertain, they're non-denominational, why there's, so many people go to them, I mean, some of them were huge, and he said, the easier the church, the more the following.
Mm-hmm.
And some of them are feel-good churches,
Mhm.
and don't teach the whole,
Yep. If there was a lot more sermons on hell, sin, condemnation, probably wouldn't be near as many people in those congregations, because that's not what they want to hear. They don't want to hear that we are sinners, that the wages of sin is death, that hell is hot. They don't want to hear that. They want to hear that, hey, we're all on the same path. It's going to be great, isn't it? Heaven's going to be great, and we're all on the same path. We're just coming at it from different angles. That's nice to hear, isn't it? That's nice to hear that, my neighbor who is something else, we're on the same path. We'll meet in the end. But unfortunately, that's not the way it is. He tells us specifically, there is one way. And that way is narrow, not wide.
You find it.
And few that find it. That's, I always, whenever I hear that, few will find it, I always refer back to Noah. And how many millions of people were on this earth. And how many were saved? 8. 8. And there were millions of people on this earth. I think that is few. But he tells us again that there will be few saved. So what kind of responsibility does that put on someone that wants to be a part of God's kingdom to be in that few? How important is it to live our life, as Dan said, anew, as a new person, to put off the old man, to put on the new? How important is that? Do we just take off a few things and still keep a little bit to ourselves? It's easy to do. But is that what he says? When we put on Christ, what are we putting on? The robe. The garments that will get us, we talked about the wedding. The garments that get us into the feast. It's our responsibility to do that. But if we don't, what can we expect? Who are you? I don't know you. Dan.
Yeah, I won't read the whole thing, but you can take a chance. When you get time, read it. But Luke chapter 14, starting in verse 25, talks about the cost of discipleship.
Mhm.
And he used the example of a man who started to build a house, but didn't count the cost, unable to finish. A lot of Christians are like that.
Right.
They get baptized and then they don't understand the cost. And
Right.
it goes unfinished and they never complete the task.
Right.
So, it's a great
It-
example.
It is. It's a very good example because we all have to make the decision what we're going to do I'm always reminded of the verse, work out your own salvation. That's not working as per se, doing good deeds to gain our salvation. But it's like work, isn't it? To remain a Christian is something that we have to dedicate ourselves to. I look at the work that I do, braiding rawhide or engraving silver. That didn't come overnight. That wasn't just something that, oh, wow, I just turned out a phenomenal piece there, museum quality in that. It didn't happen like that. It was something I had to dedicate a lot of time to. A lot of trial and error. There was cost involved. Okay. Am I perfect now? Nope. Never will be. There's always something more I can learn. Isn't that the way the Christian life is? Isn't it a constant struggle to strive to get better, to please God? Constant struggle. It costs us. But yet, we don't look at that as necessarily a job, do we? Like we would something out in the world. We're pretty faithful. If it's 8 to 5, we're there at 8 o'clock and we clock out at 5. We don't miss. Why? But it's our job. It's how we make a living. But yet when it comes to this job, our spiritual job of doing all that we can to further ourselves with wisdom from His Word, to live the example before others in the world, to go out and teach them and baptize them, as it says in Matthew 26, we don't treat that quite as seriously, do we? I mean, we will on Sundays and Wednesdays, and maybe one Saturday a month. We'll put ourselves out for that. But yet, do we do it like we would a job that we have 8 to 5 days a week?
You should. This is a 24-hour job.
Exactly. It's all the time. It's all the time that we have to constantly be alert, aware, applying ourselves. Because as it says, Satan is out there like a roaring lion, seeking to devour. And yet we just kind of treat it like, well, it's no big deal. Andrew?
Something I was thinking about, kind of thinking back about the original question, the attitude of some in the world that as a Church of Christ we think we're the only ones going to heaven. And that attitude probably has been present in the past, and that's why why there are people that think that about this church, about that there's the reason people think that.
Mm-hmm.
We also can be guilty of thinking that, well, because we're in the church, we're okay.
Right.
Not necessarily judging them, but just assuming that because we go to a church that says Church of Christ on it, that we're okay. I think sometimes what's difficult for us as Christians is when we look at, it's real easy to look at a religion that fundamentally is just wrong. They teach the wrong fundamentals about baptism and salvation. But what about the church that has the correct fundamentals? They believe in baptism is necessary for salvation, and they teach the fundamentals correctly, but then they have some places where they're in error about how they worship, or different aspects of the way they worship God. They have error in their teaching.
Yep.
I think for us as Christians, that's where the difficulty is, knowing where do we and them stand,
Right.
as far as fellowship with God.
Mm-hmm.
We know we don't have fellowship with anyone who doesn't have fellowship with God. That's
Right.
the meaning of the fellowship. We have a likeness with our service to Him. But in those churches that maybe teach fundamentally correct, but yet there's error in other aspects of the way they worship God. I think that's where, for us, many times we have difficulty in knowing what's that relationship for them. Fortunately for us, we're not the judge, so we don't have to decide for them.
Mhm.
But we also have an obligation to try to teach those that we think are in error.
Right. And that's what we kind of pointed out. Just because it says Church of Christ on the building or the sign doesn't mean that that's the place that you go. Because as you say, they may believe fundamentally the plan of salvation correctly. But aren't there churches out there that have the right name, that have instrumental music, that have other things, as you mentioned, Andrew, going on that is not according to this? Well, what do you do about that? Are they going to heaven? They got the right name, right? That's where it's so important that we go ahead.
What about a church with a different name,
That's
but is teaching fundamentally the right things?
exactly.
I don't mean an unscriptural name. There are, like we talked about last week, there are various names that the church is called by in the New Testament. So what if they go by one of those names?
Right. If there was a Church of God in a town, would we be opposed to that because it didn't say Church of Christ?
I think that would give some people heartburn.
Exactly.
I think it would, just because what our tradition, what we're used to.
Exactly. What we are, and that's the key word, our tradition of what we're used to.
We have to be careful of that. We'll be guilty like the Pharisees, where they held their man-made traditions and
Exactly.
weightier matters.
Exactly. And that's one of the things I think that is so important in understanding what we are as a group of people that are of the body of Christ. We're many members, but there is only one body. And this body is worldwide. There are many members right now meeting today that are unified with us through one thing, Christ. Now there are many members that have a different idea of what worship is. Some might have a 3-hour sermon. Some might sing songs for 45 minutes. Some might have 5 or 6 prayers. That's different. Does it make it wrong? Does it make it wrong? But that's not according to our tradition, is it? We're used to 2 songs and a prayer, a song, the Lord's Supper, another song, a sermon, a closing song, and a prayer. That's what we're used to. Would it be wrong to have 8 songs? Would it be wrong to have every man in here lead a prayer? Or have a 1-hour sermon instead of a 35-minute one? Wouldn't be wrong at all, would it?
As long as each man's faithful. We don't want Joe Blow from the church down the street coming in here leading prayer.
No, but I'm talking about
The body.
the body of Christ.
And that's good.
Or have 2 or 3 men get up and preach. But in all honesty, would we be comfortable with that? Think about it. Would we be comfortable with that? Because it's different than our tradition. Dan and then Andrew.
I think, as an elder, a few times we had changed up the worship service.
Mhm.
So people wouldn't be just mundane, this is what's happening.
Exactly.
And you wouldn't believe the people that it upset. Because, we had a point where normally it would have been a prayer, and because we didn't have a prayer at that moment, there was men in the congregation that was like, wait a minute.
Yeah. Like, whoa, we're out of order here.
Yeah, and it really upsets people for non-scriptural items.
Yep, exactly. Andrew?
We went through a transition very similar to what Dan's talking about. Where we were at in Oklahoma, we met twice on Sunday, morning and evening. And that was just what they'd done for forever. And some of the members were older, couldn't drive after dark, so we decided, let's just have one service, similar to like what we do here. But for some people, that was very uncomfortable to the point where they wanted 2 sermons during the one service. So that's what we did for a while, was we had a sermon, then we had Bible study, then communion, then we had another sermon. And that, because people were so used to what the tradition was, it made them feel guilty to not follow that tradition, even though that's all it was a tradition. And that's dangerous, that we get so attached to our tradition that something that varies a little bit, like the number of sermons that were given, made them feel like they were doing something wrong. After we left, I found out they went to one sermon. We were doing 2 when I was there, but like I said, after we left, they went to one sermon. But that people were so tied to that tradition, they felt like they were doing something sinful if they didn't have 2 sermons on
Exactly.
And that can be dangerous.
I remember distinctly when we were traveling with the kids, and we went to a congregation that did the Lord's Supper at the beginning. It literally looked like our children were about to rattle out of their skin. You're like, they're like, you're like, they were panicked that we were in a wrong place because we didn't follow that footprint of tradition that they were raised with, and their eyes were big and looking upset and panicked, and I thought, we gotta be careful here, but you start that tradition.
We do, and we get used to that. And it tells us exactly that's what the Pharisees wanted, wasn't it? They wanted that scripted worship. This is the way we do it. This. Now, as long as we include everything that he tells us to include on the first day of the week in our worship, and to exclude some of those things that should not be there, like instrumental music, or a woman getting up and preaching, are we okay to maybe change up the order a little bit? Not that we change and put the cup before the bread, because it gives us an example of what came first. But can we have a sermon first? Can we have the Lord's Supper first? Can we have multiple prayers? Can we have scripture reading? There's nothing that says anything against that, is there? As long as it's orderly. Now, we have a tendency to have orderly as we have this and we don't deviate from that. But what I mean orderly is that we don't have 2 or 3 people praying at the same time. And we don't have somebody preaching back there and serving the Lord's Supper up here and singing out in the parking lot. That's not orderly. But we do have a tendency to get kind of stuck in a rut. And I don't believe that's what Christ wants us to be. He tells us there is freedom in Him. That doesn't mean that we just go out and do whatever we want. But it gives us freedom that we're not bound by so many criteria that the Pharisees had. That's what they implied and put on the people. You got to do this, or that ain't going to work. And most of those were man-made traditions. These are what we follow. These are not traditions. These are the guidelines as a Christian should follow. Andrew and then Roger.
Yeah, following the example is obviously important because the pendulum can swing the opposite direction. There are churches labeled the Church of Christ on the outside of the building that have women preachers and have embraced that as just staying, keeping up with the times and things of that nature, and completely ignored the examples and directives that we do have.
Yep.
So we have to be careful that we don't just for the sake of change, let's change things up so people don't become
Oh, absolutely.
ingrained in their traditions.
Yeah, and I'm not portraying that, next Sunday, we're gonna have this completely messed up.
Right.
I'm not saying that. But we have to realize how easy it is for us as humans to get stuck on some things. That was tradition. We've always done that. That's no different than out in the world saying, you know what? My family has been this for years and I'm not going to change because it's tradition. That can lead them straight to hell. And it could lead us as the Church of Christ straight to hell too. Because we are so enamored with tradition that we don't realize what we're doing. Roger.
So I think the main factor is you have to ask yourself, is it going to change the worship? You know, like an example, somebody wants, well, isn't a pitch pipe instrumental music? Say, well, I can't play a tune on it, and it's just an aid. It doesn't change the singing. It helps us pitch the song so we have good singing. But if you bring a piano in, you start playing it, that changes the worship. And so that's kind of the big question you have to continually ask. So switching things up doesn't affect the worship. It just changes the order of it. So it's
Exactly.
opinion.
If we had 5 songs before, would that make a difference?
It's the same worship.
It's the same worship. But now if we put Wonder Bread up here,
Now you change it.
that will change it, wouldn't it? That would change it. That's where we can't go there. And that's what I'm saying is that as long as we adhere to what he tells us, then we are of one body. If we go another direction, then we can't say that we're part of that one body. Because there is criteria for those that are in Christ. And how they worship, how they conduct themselves, what their example is before others. Paul.
Going back to the basic question about that criticism that people in the church think they're only the one going to heaven, people in the churches of Christ. Just because that criticism is out there, right or wrong, let's don't get embarrassed about the name.
Right.
Let's stop apologizing for the name.
Right.
It is the Church of Christ because He is our head.
Exactly.
In Ephesians 1 that I read last week in the lesson, you know, the entire eternal plan of God is summed up in Jesus Christ.
Yep.
Every spiritual blessing is in Him. You know, sadly, people are calling the church all kinds of. Read one recently, they called the church the Wave. What does that mean?
Right.
They're embarrassed about the name.
Mm-hmm.
If we're ashamed of the name,
Exactly.
I'll have to tell you what the result of that is.
Right.
Let's stop it. Apologizing for the name. So often people are wanting to, you know, wow, let's just don't say that. No, we are, if we are faithful, if we've been obedient, we are of the churches of Christ.
Right. And that's important, isn't it? I think that's a very good point. We shouldn't be ashamed of the name, the Church of Christ, because who established it? Christ did.
It's Christ.
Who owns it?
Christ.
Christ does.
Reference as the church is the bride of Christ.
Exactly.
That's why we take his name.
And there is only one, isn't there? As we read in Ephesians, there's only one church. There's only one body. There's only one Christ. Hubie and then Cole.
Yeah, a good example of that is years ago the church was torn apart by what's called the one cupper. Men decided that the cup was more important than the contents. And they pushed that issue and split churches.
Mhm.
Many people probably lost their soul over it. And today you still have them in spots. The beauty about it though, me and you can go and worship there and drink out of the one cup, but they can't come here.
Mhm.
And
Right,
whether it's one cup or multiple cups, the contents is what counts. But
right.
the man that made an argument about that,
Mhm.
horrible consequence.
Man distinguished something.
Cup
That-
is just the aid still, that's the aid to help you take it.
Exactly. It's not the cup itself, it's the contents that represents his what? His blood. I mean, that's the bottom line. Now, what if we possibly had wine instead of grape juice? It would be offensive to some people. It would be.
We do have wine, because there's like 3 versions of wine in the Bible. This is
Mhm.
not fermented.
Right. But if we did happen to have a diluted fermented wine, would that be offensive? To some people it would,
Yeah.
because they might have a problem with
We have to remember the context of the time period. They didn't just have a fridge, they could just put their grape juice in and preserve it. Sometimes
Exactly.
the only way to preserve things was to let them ferment or to cure.
Mhm.
So I think we can't use the same excuse, but I
Right.
think it's a matter of context. And the reason for that is God will speak where he needs to, but there is places he leaves for our discretion. But what we have to be careful of is not to let those spaces of discretion become more important than the weightier matters like the Pharisees did. Whether it's one cup or a bunch of little cups, or whether you start with the prayer or start with the sermon, we can't let, or whether it says Church of Christ or Church of God, because when we're baptized, we give up our name and we take on his name. And so when we take on his name, we're supposed to be all about him, not about what we think we should do, what we think can be here and can't be here. It's all about him. And sometimes we get so caught up in those little areas of discretion that God put there on purpose, because if he had to nickel and dime us for every little thing we do, we'd be a bunch of robots out here with no conscience and no freedom of choice. But we have to make sure that those points of discretion don't become more important than the points that save our
Right.
souls.
Right, right.
So back to the context of the wine, the first
Mhm.
century wine wasn't, I don't know how they make it, but it's the percentage, alcohol percentage is a lot higher today than it was back in the Bible days. It was really
Mhm.
weak.
And they watered it down.
Yeah.
They watered it down.
So it's not this, the wine you buy in the store today is
Right.
not the same wine that the first century Christians.
But I think Cole's got a very good point. It's to our discretion. Like he said, they didn't have refrigeration back then. Okay? We do today. We do today. And we can choose what if it's going to be offensive for someone to have a fermented wine, then we choose not to do that. That's the freedom that we have. Now, we can turn that around and say, well, I'm going to do this anyway. Well, what does that do? That, once again, puts us in control instead of Christ. We're our own people then. We're not a part of the body.
Paul addresses that. Don't let your good be thought of as evil.
Exactly. Exactly. Because there is too many times people want to put their ideals first, because I have the freedom to do that, and they forget about the body. They forget about the whole. Because it could be bad for someone. Gary, did you have something? Okay. I didn't cover everything, so I might give you one more week of reprise. We got one more question that I wanted to bring up, and we didn't get a chance to do that today. So probably one more week, and then we'll finish up this lesson. But thank you all for your comments. I think it's important that we have the discussion that we do, because it brings up a lot of things that, do we think about those things? Do we truly think about the order in which we worship? Are we stuck in a rut sometimes? Is it uncomfortable when things aren't going the way we've always done it? As Christians, we need to be extremely flexible, don't we? How flexible was Christ? Think about it. When he walked out into a crowd of people, how flexible was he? Was he looking at those in need? Or was he looking at their status in the community? He came for who? He came for the lost, the sick, the downtrodden. He came for those people. We have to have that same mindset. Andrew, and we'll close. Okay.
Is it possible that we have traditions that we should be uncomfortable with? Like something that we've just gotten comfortable with doing that maybe we need to take a closer look at? Is that possible?
Exactly. Because I think we can get to that point, as the Pharisees did, that this is what we've always done, and we haven't really looked into it to see if it's really what we need to be doing. And if it's not according to this, if it's something that we made up years ago, that we thought, well, that sounded good at the time, and we've always done it that way, so why change now? There's going to be a lot of people that said, Lord, Lord, all these things that I did in your name, I did them in your name. And he's going to say, I don't know you. I don't know you. Next week. Thank you, Andrew.